The vast expanse of the galaxy had seen countless conflicts, but none quite like the one humanity was about to face. This wasn't a war of technology or sheer numbers. It was a clash of ideologies, the meeting of two vastly different worlds, one cold, calculating, and brutal, the other raw, passionate, and relentless. And in this conflict, humanity was going to teach a lesson that the alien invaders would never forget. The aliens, for all their superior technology and vast military power, had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated humanity. It had been an ordinary day at the military academy located on a Deathworld, one of the few places in the galaxy where humans could train in such extreme conditions. The young cadets, fresh-faced and eager, were about to face the most intense test of their lives, a mock assault by an overwhelming alien force. What was supposed to be a training exercise turned into a battle for survival as the academy was thrust into a conflict far beyond anyone's expectations. And at the heart of this battle stood Eric, a young man with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The cadets, though outnumbered and outgunned, were ready to show that they were not the weak, primitive species the galaxy believed them to be. The aliens had no idea what was coming. The aliens, a towering insectoid species, had never encountered anything like Earth. To them, the humans were a mere nuisance, a low-level species that had never posed any real threat to the galaxy. They had conquered countless worlds, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. They saw Earth as little more than a blip on the map, a primitive death world that barely registered in their calculations. The Academy's cadets, who had been raised in the harshest conditions their planet could offer, were expected to fold under the pressure. But the aliens had miscalculated. They had failed to understand one fundamental truth about humanity. Humans didn't fear death. They embraced it. The battle began with a series of bombings and orbital strikes, designed to break the cadets' resolve and leave them no choice but to surrender. But the cadets had been prepared for this. Eric and his comrades had spent years training for this moment, not in simulations or virtual reality, but in the real, unforgiving wilderness of Earth. They had learned to survive in deserts that could strip flesh from bone, in freezing polar wastelands, and in forests that were home to the deadliest predators in the galaxy. They had learned the art of surviving against the odds, of using everything at their disposal to turn the tables on even the most powerful enemies. As the alien forces descended on the Academy, their ships filled the sky, casting long shadows over the terrain. The cadets, though surrounded and vastly outnumbered, didn't panic. They knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about survival. This was about proving to the galaxy that humans were not to be underestimated. And so they fought. They fought with the ferocity of a species that had endured countless hardships, that had seen its share of destruction and loss, but had never been broken. They fought because they knew that if they failed, humanity would be seen as weak, easily crushed under the boot of superior forces. That was a fate they could not accept. Eric and his unit were stationed in the dense forest that surrounded the Academy. These were not the kinds of environments the alien forces were accustomed to. The aliens were powerful, yes, but their size and strength made them slow and cumbersome in the dense underbrush. The humans, small and quick, had learned to move silently through the forest, using terrain to their advantage. Eric's team knew how to move like shadows, striking quickly and disappearing before the enemy had a chance to retaliate. It was in these moments of skirmish that the true nature of humanity's strength became clear. The aliens, for all their technological advancements, couldn't match the human will to survive. While the aliens relied on their technology and overwhelming firepower, the humans relied on their cunning, their adaptability, and their deep-rooted drive to protect what was theirs. It wasn't just about weapons or strategies. It was about heart, and that was something the aliens didn't understand. They had never known a species that fought so fiercely, so unrelentingly. In every attack, in every ambush, the aliens learned that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Eric, whose life had been shaped by loss, felt the weight of his mission more than most. He had lost his family to an alien raid when he was a child, an event that had driven him to enlist. His personal vendetta against the invaders burned in his chest as he fought. Every alien soldier he brought down was a small revenge for the lives lost. He wasn't just fighting for his survival. He was fighting for those who had been lost long before he had ever stepped onto the battlefield. Despite their growing losses, The alien forces remained confident. They had assumed that they were invincible, that the humans would be crushed beneath their might. But as the days wore on, they began to realize that the humans were not the easy prey they had expected. The alien commanders, once sure of their victory, started to panic. Their troops were being picked off one by one, not by overwhelming force, but by relentless, calculated strikes. The humans didn't need superior numbers. They just needed the will to win. The aliens made a fatal mistake in underestimating their enemy. They had assumed that they could use sheer force to crush the humans, but they hadn't accounted for the human spirit. It wasn't something that could be measured in firepower or body count. It was something far more intangible. And as the battle raged on, it became clear that the aliens had gravely miscalculated. They had thought themselves gods of war, but they had learned too late that the humans were far more than a mere inconvenience. They were the true heirs of Deathworlds, creatures born to survive, no matter the odds. It wasn't just about technology or firepower. It was about humanity's ability to adapt, to outthink and outlast their enemies. And as Eric and his comrades continued to fight, the aliens began to understand that they were not facing a species that would bend to their will. They were facing a force of nature, something that could not be destroyed, no matter how many weapons were aimed at it. The message was clear. Humanity had come to play, and the galaxy would never forget the lesson they were about to teach. The war had already begun, though it wasn't what the aliens expected. What they thought would be a swift victory turned into a battle of attrition, each moment drawing them further into a war they were unprepared for. The alien forces were relentless, their military tactics honed through centuries of conquest, yet they were utterly unprepared for the kind of warfare humanity was capable of. This was no ordinary war. It was a clash of an empire that had grown complacent against a species that had never known peace and had only learned to survive through conflict. The humans, small and seemingly insignificant in the eyes of the invaders, had fought with an intensity that alien commanders could not understand. What began as a battle for survival soon became a struggle for the soul of humanity. The aliens underestimated not only the terrain, but also the psychology of their enemies. For them, victory was a simple equation of firepower and numbers. Their species had conquered entire planets without the slightest resistance, obliterating civilizations in their wake. It had always been the same: invade, crush, and dominate. But they had learned one crucial lesson too late. Humans, unlike any species they had encountered, had an unshakable resolve. The invaders relied on sheer force, not intelligence or adaptability. And in doing so, they missed the most dangerous aspect of their human adversaries: humanity's ability to adapt and fight back. The human cadets, despite their initial shock and confusion, had quickly realized that they were outgunned and outnumbered. But unlike their alien counterparts, they did not panic. The aliens were used to overwhelming their enemies with sheer might. But humans had a different way of approaching conflict. It wasn't about superior firepower. It was about outthinking the enemy, about using the environment to their advantage, and most importantly, about finding ways to exploit the smallest of weaknesses. These were the lessons humanity had learned over centuries of struggle and survival, and these lessons would be their salvation in the face of overwhelming odds. In the early days of the conflict, the aliens believed that their technological superiority would be more than enough to crush the humans. Their weapons were more advanced, their ships larger, and their armies vast. They assumed that the humans would fall into disarray and surrender when faced with their might. But the cadets, having been trained to think beyond the obvious, quickly began to adopt unconventional tactics. They understood that victory in this kind of war wasn't about meeting the enemy head-on. It was about survival, about using the enemy's own strengths against them. The first realization came when the alien forces attempted to deploy their heavy artillery, hoping to annihilate the human defenses in a single, decisive strike. But instead of attempting to defend directly, the cadets set up traps, creating a labyrinth of obstacles that turned the enemy's weapons against them. The cadets used the alien artillery as bait, luring the invaders into ambushes where their advanced technology couldn't help them. The aliens found themselves unable to navigate the terrain, and their reliance on sheer power became their greatest weakness. As the weeks passed, the alien commanders became increasingly frustrated. Their forces, though vast, were scattered and disorganized, unable to respond effectively to humans' guerrilla tactics. The invaders had grown so accustomed to their dominance that they had never trained to fight in such an unpredictable environment. The humans, on the other hand, thrived in chaos. They knew how to use their surroundings to their advantage, how to turn the simplest of tools into deadly weapons. Where the aliens saw vast, empty landscapes, the humans saw opportunities. It was during these moments that the alien commanders began to realize the gravity of their mistake. They had underestimated the human spirit. The humans, for all their shortcomings in terms of size and strength, fought with an intensity and tenacity that was unmatched. The cadets weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for their very existence. They fought for their families, their homes, their way of life. And in every battle, in every ambush, the aliens could feel the weight of the humans' resolve. But the true brilliance of humanity lay not in their tactics, but in their ability to adapt. Unlike the aliens, who relied on established doctrine and strategies, the humans were fluid in their approach. They learned from every encounter, adjusting and improving with each passing day. What had started as a series of small victories soon snowballed into something much larger. The aliens found themselves on the defensive, retreating into their ships as the humans began to push them back. But even as the humans gained ground, the aliens were relentless. They responded with greater force, hoping to overwhelm the humans with sheer numbers and firepower. But the cadets had learned to fight smarter, not harder. They had learned to take what the aliens gave them and turn it into an advantage. The aliens, despite their vast numbers, were no match for the humans' adaptability and determination. As the conflict escalated, the alien forces began to crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. They had failed to consider the one thing that made humanity different: their sheer will to survive. They had underestimated the resolve of the species that had faced extinction time and time again, and had never been broken. The aliens had conquered countless worlds, but they had never faced a species like humanity, a species that had turned the tables on even the most powerful of enemies. It was in these moments of desperation that the aliens realized the full extent of their mistake. They had assumed that their technology, their overwhelming firepower, would be enough to subdue the humans. But they had failed to account for the heart of humanity, the will to survive, to fight back, and to never give up. The invaders had come to conquer, but instead, they had stumbled into the path of a species that would not bow to anyone, no matter how powerful they were. The aliens learned the hard way that no matter how advanced their technology or how vast their armies, they could not defeat the human spirit. The lesson was simple: underestimate humanity at your own peril. The cadets had not only survived, they had shown the galaxy that humanity was far more than just a nuisance. They were a force to be reckoned with, and any alien species that thought otherwise would soon find out the true meaning of the human spirit. The momentum of the battle had shifted, and the aliens began to realize the gravity of their mistake. What they had once dismissed as an inconsequential species, primitive and weak, had turned the tide of war in ways the invaders could never have predicted. It was no longer just about the individual skirmishes or the tactical advantages that the cadets had exploited. It was about a fundamental clash of cultures, a war of ideologies where the aliens, despite their technological might, were starting to lose the one thing they had always relied on: certainty. The very thing that made them powerful, their unshakable belief in their superiority, was now their downfall. The alien forces had come to Earth with overwhelming force, expecting to crush any resistance within days, if not hours. They believed they could simply overpower humanity with their superior weapons, their superior tactics, and their superior technology. But they had failed to recognize one key truth: humanity had always survived by thinking differently. For all their advanced machinery, their vast fleets, the aliens had underestimated the one thing that mattered most in a war: a species will survive. The cadets had begun to show them exactly what that meant. What the aliens had perceived as human desperation had quickly turned into the force that drove them to impossible victories. Every attack, every skirmish, seemed to strip away the alien sense of invincibility. And it was in this moment of realization that they made their fatal error. They began to overestimate their own strength, while underestimating the potential of their adversary. As the humans continued to fight with ferocity and determination, the aliens began to buckle under pressure. The invaders, once so sure of their victory, were now forced to reconsider their approach. The harsh, unforgiving nature of Earth was no longer something to be ignored. The terrain, the relentless resilience of the human cadets, and the sheer ingenuity of their tactics had made the invaders question everything they thought they knew about war. For the first time, they felt vulnerable. They were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. The once unshakable confidence of the alien commanders began to crumble, and with it, their strategic advantage. In this phase of the war, it became clear that the cadets weren't merely trying to survive. They were preparing for final assault, the moment when they would break the alien forces once and for all. The humans had learned their enemies' weaknesses, and they began to exploit them mercilessly. The alien forces, already disoriented by the guerrilla tactics and relentless ambushes, were now facing an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. The key to this realization was the human ability to adapt. While the aliens had stuck to traditional strategies, thinking that sheer force would win the day, the humans began to improvise, to create unexpected situations that forced the invaders to fight on multiple fronts. The cadets weren't just playing defense anymore. They were actively hunting down the alien commanders, striking at the heart of their operations. It was then that the true nature of human ingenuity became apparent. The cadets had developed strategies that no one had anticipated. They used the aliens' own technology against them, turning their own weapons and vehicles into deadly traps. Every piece of alien equipment that was captured became a resource, an advantage that could be turned into a weapon of their own. The humans were no longer relying solely on the weapons they had. They were transforming the invaders' strength into their own. The aliens had been taught the hard way that underestimating humanity meant facing a constant barrage of tactics and surprises that could not be anticipated. The invaders had no time to react, no time to recover. The momentum of the battle continued to swing in favor of the humans, and the aliens, for the first time, began to realize that their situation was dire. They had underestimated Earth, its people, and its relentless drive to survive. The alien commanders were forced to make decisions they had never considered before. They attempted to regroup, to rally their forces and put an end to the humans' resistance, but every move they made seemed to result in further setbacks. The more they tried to assert control, the more the humans adapted, countering every tactic with a new one, always staying one step ahead. The aliens' technological superiority was beginning to feel hollow, as every new weapon they deployed was met with an equally innovative response from the cadets. It wasn't just about strategy anymore. It was about a clash of wills. The aliens were losing the war not because they lacked power, but because they had lost a psychological edge. They had believed that their advanced technology and their vast forces could crush humanity's resistance, but they had failed to account for the human spirit. The invaders had been conditioned to conquer, to dominate without question. They had never encountered a species that would fight back with such desperation, such intensity, and above all, such unity. The humans, despite their small numbers, had formed a bond that could not be broken. They fought not just for survival, but for something greater, for the future of their world, their species, and their way of life. And then came the moment of reckoning. The alien command structure, once so confident in its superiority, began to crack. The invaders started to fracture, their unity unraveling under the pressure of a war they had no plan for. The once fearsome alien commanders were now scrambling, desperately attempting to reorganize their forces. But the damage had already been done. The human cadets, who had once been seen as mere children playing at war, had become a true threat. The final battle was no longer a matter of if. It was a matter of when. The humans, fueled by the lessons they had learned in the heat of battle, were now on the verge of delivering the final blow to the invaders. And when that blow came, it would not only be a victory, it would be a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity. As the alien forces prepared to make one last desperate stand, they could feel the shift in the air. The humans, who had once been on the verge of defeat, were now poised to deliver a crushing blow. The aliens had underestimated them at every turn, and now they would pay the price. For the humans, it was no longer just about winning a war. It was about sending a message that would resonate across the galaxy. Do not underestimate humanity. They may be small, they may be weak, but when pushed to the brink, they will rise, and they will fight like no other species ever has. And in the end, it would be the invaders who would learn the greatest lesson of all. The final assault was inevitable, and the tension was palpable. The alien forces, who had once believed themselves invincible, now found themselves on the precipice of total collapse. The sheer weight of their miscalculations bore down on them, and despite their best efforts, they could not escape the truth that had become apparent. Humanity had evolved beyond their expectations. What had once been an insurmountable force, the alien military, was now crumbling under the relentless ingenuity of human resistance. The humans had adapted, learned, and fought back with fervor that no one had anticipated. As the days passed, the alien command structure began to splinter, weakened by internal divisions, with commanders disagreeing on the best course of action. This uncertainty was their undoing. Humanity had learned how to turn the tide of war, not through overwhelming force or technological superiority, but through sheer resilience and the power of unity. The invaders, despite their advanced weaponry, could not match the strategic flexibility and tactical genius of the human cadets. The aliens had once believed they could simply outmuscle their enemies, assuming that their superior technology would be enough to subdue any force they encountered. But in humanity, they had found something they had never expected, an adversary that did not rely solely on strength but on intelligence, adaptability, and a refusal to be broken. It became increasingly clear that the tide of the war was turning in humanity's favor. The aliens, reeling from their earlier miscalculations, now faced the devastating reality that they had underestimated their foes. The cadets had fought not only to survive, but to overcome a force far superior in size, technology, and experience. In every battle, in every engagement, the humans had learned, adapted, and refined their strategies. The alien forces, once confident in their domination of the galaxy, were now finding themselves on the defensive. The cadets had turned the very strengths of the invaders into weaknesses, exploiting their overconfidence and their rigidity in strategy. The humans had transformed their vulnerability into a weapon, their desperation into resolve. As the battle raged on, the alien commanders began to realize that they were not just losing a war, they were losing an entire campaign. Their once proud fleets, now scattered and disorganized, struggled to maintain any semblance of order. The humans, though fewer in number, had begun to engage in asymmetrical warfare with such precision and efficiency that the alien invaders were unable to keep up. Every time the aliens thought they had a victory in their grasp, the cadets would strike back with strategies so unexpected that the invaders could only watch in stunned silence as their forces crumbled. What had started as a small, seemingly insignificant resistance had now grown into an unstoppable force. Humanity, with its unmatched adaptability and insatiable thirst for survival, had proven to be far more than just a nuisance. They had shown the galaxy that they were capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined. The aliens, who had initially come to Earth expecting a quick and easy conquest, now found themselves in the midst of a war they could not win. The humans had become a thorn in their side, one that they could not remove, no matter how much firepower they threw at it. The moment of reckoning was near. The aliens, struggling to regroup, sent out desperate calls for reinforcements, hoping to change the tide. But reinforcements were slow to arrive, and by the time they did, it was already too late. The humans had already established their dominance on the battlefield. The invaders, now fragmented and weakened, could not mount an effective counteroffensive. Their technological superiority had become irrelevant in the face of human determination and tactical brilliance. The aliens had realized, far too late, that no amount of technology could defeat the willpower of a species that had been forged in the fires of survival. The final confrontation came swiftly. The human forces, organized and united, descended upon the alien command center with surgical precision. The invaders, overwhelmed by the sheer speed and coordination of the human assault, found themselves unable to respond effectively. Their communication systems were jammed, their defenses rendered useless by the relentless onslaught. The aliens, who had once believed themselves to be the apex of creation, were now trapped in a web of their own making. Their advanced technology, their fleets, their armies, none of it mattered now. They had underestimated their foes in a way that would cost them everything. In the final moments, as the human forces closed in on the alien leadership, the reality of their defeat became undeniable. The invaders, once so confident in their superiority, were now being forced to surrender, to negotiate, to beg for mercy. The humans, though victorious, did not offer it. The message had already been delivered. The aliens had learned their lesson, and humanity had proven once again that it was not to be trifled with. The invaders had expected to dominate, to crush a primitive species. Instead, they had been outsmarted, outclassed, and outlasted. They had learned the hard way that humanity's greatest strength lay not in technology or firepower, but in their relentless will to survive. As the last alien forces were rounded up and their ships forced to retreat, the full weight of their defeat began to sink in. They had come to Earth with arrogance, expecting an easy victory, but they had been met with a species unlike any they had ever encountered. Humanity, small and seemingly insignificant in the grand scale of the galaxy, had turned the tables and forced the invaders into retreat. The lesson was clear, not just for the aliens, but for anyone who dared to face humanity in the future. Underestimate them at your peril. Humanity's spirit could not be broken, and they would never be a species to submit to anyone, no matter how powerful they were. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and humans stood victorious, the invaders were left with nothing but their shattered pride and the bitter realization that they had misjudged the species they thought they could conquer. Humanity, united in purpose and driven by an unyielding resolve, had emerged triumphant. The aliens had learned a lesson that would resonate throughout the galaxy for generations to come. Never underestimate the power of a species that has nothing left to lose. The war was over, but the scars left on both sides would last forever. Humanity stood victorious, but the price had been steep, and the emotional weight of the conflict was heavier than any of the cadets had imagined. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival had turned into a lesson that would echo across the galaxy for centuries. The invaders, once convinced of their invincibility, had learned a hard truth about humanity. No matter how great the odds, the human spirit could not be crushed. The aftermath of the war left not just the alien forces reeling, but also a deep reflection on what it meant to be human. The cadets, who had once been seen as the underdogs, now found themselves honored as heroes, their bravery and resourcefulness etched into the history of their species. Yet, despite their hard-won victory, they were not celebrated for their conquest alone. The true victory had come in the form of what they had proven, not just to the aliens, but to themselves. In the heat of battle, humanity had tapped into something greater than sheer willpower or military strategy. They had united across boundaries, across nations, cultures, and ideals. They had found common ground in the most unlikely of places, discovering the strength of their shared humanity. The cadets had not just fought for survival. They had fought for the future of the species, for the hope that humanity could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it seemed. The galaxy, now aware of humanity's strength, would never be the same. The alien forces had retreated, but the damage to their confidence was far deeper than any wound they could have suffered in battle. They had come to Earth with the arrogance of a species that had never known defeat. But by the end of the war, they had been forced to reevaluate everything they had ever believed about themselves and the universe. Humanity had proven that strength was not just about power or technology, but about the capacity to endure, to adapt, and to fight on against all odds. The invaders had underestimated humanity's resilience, and now they knew better than to make that mistake again. However, the cost of the victory was not just measured in battles won or enemy forces destroyed. It was measured in the lives lost, the families shattered, and the deep emotional scars left on those who had fought. The cadets, though victorious, bore the weight of their experiences in ways no one could have predicted. They had seen the face of war up close, had lived through its horrors, its sacrifices, and its unrelenting cruelty. They had emerged stronger, yes, but they had also lost parts of themselves in the process. They had become soldiers, but they had also become something else, witnesses to a conflict that had forever changed the way they viewed their place in the universe. As the dust settled and the cadets returned to their families, they were hailed as heroes, but there was no true celebration. There was no joy in victory, not the way anyone had imagined. The human race had survived, but they had also been irrevocably altered by the war. The unity that had been forged in battle remained, but it was a unity born from shared trauma, from a knowledge that no victory was without its cost. The The cadets, though revered, struggled to find peace in a world that would never again be the same. The war had opened their eyes to the harsh realities of life and death, to the fleeting nature of existence, and to fragility of the bonds that held society together. In the years that followed, humanity's victory became a turning point in the history of the galaxy. No longer seen as the underdog, Earth and its people gained respect in the galactic community. But respect came with a price. The alien forces had retreated, but their influence lingered. As humanity stood tall, there were whispers of revenge and the fear that one day the invaders would return. The cadets, though triumphant, could not shake the feeling that the war was far from over. The galaxy was a vast place, and they had made powerful enemies. The victory was not as absolute as it seemed, and the realization that humanity's survival was never guaranteed began to sink in. The war had been won, but it opened a door to even greater challenges. The cadets, now regarded as veterans, carried their scars with them. Some bore physical wounds, reminders of the battles they had fought, but it was the emotional scars that would prove the hardest to heal. They had seen the brutality of war firsthand, and while they had been forced to harden themselves to survive, they could never forget what they had witnessed. The loss of comrades, the destruction of entire cities, the faces of those they had been forced to leave behind. These were the memories that haunted them. The war had tested them in ways no one had ever imagined, and the weight of their experiences would stay with them forever. Yet, there was also a quiet sense of pride among the survivors. They had proven that humanity was not to be underestimated. The cadets had shown the galaxy that Earth was no longer just a blood in the far corner of space. Humanity had emerged from the crucible of war, not just as survivors, but as a force to be reckoned with. The cadets had rewritten the rules of war, proving that victory could come not from overwhelming power, but from the heart and soul of the species that refused to be broken. In the end, the lesson learned was not just about the strength of humanity in battle, but about the strength of the human spirit. The aliens had learned that lesson the hard way, at the cost of their pride, their confidence, and their future. But for humanity, the victory had been bittersweet. They had proven their worth, but they had also paid a terrible price for it. The cadets had learned that survival was not just about winning. It was about the ability to endure, to rebuild, and to carry the weight of what had been lost. The war had ended, but the journey was far from over. The galaxy was vast, and humanity had only just begun to understand its place within it. And while they had won this battle, the true test of their strength had only just begun. The lessons learned on the battlefield would shape the future of humanity forever, guiding them toward a future where their strength would be matched only by the hope they carried in their hearts.